Hi there, good afternoon everyone. Historical Trauma and Transformation Studies would like to welcome you all to this webinar. Welcome to the panelists, the three panelists, to all our HTT Studies colleagues, and to all of you virtually attending this session. A very warm welcome to you. So the title of today's session is Gender-Based Violence Under COVID-19 Lockdown, Reflections from South Africa and Zimbabwe. And my name is Samantha van Skulkwyk. I'll be chairing this session today. It's my privilege to be here amongst our panelists, and I look forward to today's session. Just a little bit of context about our gender desk at Historical Trauma and Transformation Studies. The Gender Desk is interested in these issues of patriarchal trauma, gender trauma, and the possibilities of disrupting certain patriarchal ideologies through practice. And the aim is to generate theoretical knowledge through research that is closely linked with practices and strategies for change, and closely linked to the potential for collective work that can shift the frame of harmful meanings and practices for both individuals and communities. The work focuses on dialogues about patriarchal power and how change, disruption, and even healing can occur within spaces through which people engage with their intimate life stories. Another component of the Gender Desk is to inspire young students to take up research topics that are very close to their heart, and to do research that generates new language about the power dynamics that they witness and experience in their everyday lives in university settings, to provide them with new perspectives and a critical voice to insert these topics into certain agendas for change, and so that they themselves can go out into communities as agents of change and to disrupt these entrenched patriarchal ideologies that serve as the scaffolding of gender-based violence. Some of our students are involved in very interesting research, for example, on sexual harassment and other forms of patriarchal power that manifest within particular spaces in the university, such as university residences, and the engagement and exploration of the deep intersections between patriarchy but also white masculinity within these spaces. So we'll be hosting, the Gender Desk will be hosting a series of seminars on these topics, and you can look out for these on our website, the Historical Trauma and Transformation website, and also through the email invites as you received for this webinar today. So before we start, as per our tradition of the webinars, we'd like to get a sense of who's joining us in this virtual space. So for those of you in the audience, you'll see that at the bottom there are various icons, and we ask for the comment icon if you could send us a message with your name, your affiliation, where you are at the moment, just so that we can get a sense of who is virtually in the room with us. And we'd like to encourage you to do this. We see that we have a very good response to today's session. Lundy just informed me that we're sitting at about 195 registrations. So welcome to all of you, and we're very happy that we have such an amazing response to this session. So just as a reminder, in the comment section, you can state who you are, you know, and your affiliation. But if you have any questions to ask, please make sure to use the Q&A icon, which you'll see there is different from the comment section. And you're welcome to post your questions throughout while the panelists are giving their presentations, but we will get to the questions at the end of the session. Also for your questions, please state who you are, where you're from, and also include which panelist your question is addressed to. And we ask that you be quite clear and concise for your questions. We obviously won't get to all the questions at the end, so we'll select a few And during the course of the session, Lundi, who is our technical support, will be in contact with you and ask if you'd prefer to ask your question live. So come on live with us, or if you would prefer to write down your question and have me address it to the panelists. So both options are okay, and you can also indicate if you would like to come on live with us today. So the topic that we will be addressing today is really of critical significance in our current times. We've seen the intensification of gender-based violence within spaces of lockdown. Women, for example, confined to the home, the intimate space with abusers. And we've really seen in many cases that the dynamics of community support, community connection have been really shattered, to say the least, by what's going on with the COVID. And questions such as, what does it mean to live in intimate spaces with abusers? What does it mean to live in community settings where abuse is rife? And what sources of support are available to women, all really take on new meaning under the circumstances of COVID-19 lockdown, which has really shaped our physical and emotional world significantly, including the way that we research and understand violence against women, and then of course the strategies that we need to develop in order to address this violence. So here lies the critical significance of today's topic. So I'd like to thank the three speakers for joining us today. Our panelists all have rich experience of doing research in the field, but also of practical work, advocacy work in the field of sexual and gender-based violence. So I'd like to extend a very warm welcome, firstly to Prof. Welekazi Nduna from Wits University. Our second panelist is Dr. Naomi Wekwete from University of Zimbabwe. And then we have Welekazi Stofile from Shrawarang Legal Advocacy Center. So Prof. Welekazi will be presenting first, and her presentation is titled Understanding GBV During the 2020 COVID-19 Lockdown in South Africa. And then Dr. Wekwete will speak about gender-based violence within another context, within the Zimbabwean context. And then lastly, Welekazi will respond to both presentations, providing her thoughts and her insights from her own experiences in the field. So we really look forward to the presentations, and thank you for joining us, panelists. So to introduce the first speaker, Prof. Welekazi Nduna is an associate professor at Wits University. She's an educator, a facilitator, a researcher, and an advocate. She's affiliated to and supports a variety of academic and civil society projects and national government initiatives aimed at bridging the gap between science, theory, and practice in the field of sexual and reproductive health and rights. She's recently authored a monograph, a magnifying glass, and a fine-tooth comb, Understanding Girls and Young Women's Vulnerability. Prof. Welekazi recently shared the link to this monograph. It's hot off the press. So I believe that she will be speaking more about this publication in her presentation, but we will also be sharing the link to her ebook in the comments section. So you're welcome to have a look at that, and I encourage you, it really speaks powerfully to some of the issues that we'll be addressing here today. So Prof. Welekazi has published more than 60 peer-reviewed journal articles, 3 special issue journals, 7 book chapters, and a number of research reports in addition to this monograph. She was an expert panel member of the South African National AIDS Council, SANAC Women's Sector, the National Presidentially GBV and Femicide Interim Steering Council, and SAF-AIDS Transforming Lives Program. Prof. Welekazi has also been very closely affiliated with our unit, Historical Trauma and Transformation Studies, doing workshops for our students. And I'm always struck by the way that Prof. Welekazi makes these complex issues of violence and trauma so meaningful for students through using her own life examples and examples of her research. And another thing that struck me is that she always encourages students to think out the box, beyond these pre-established rules about the meaning of ethics, the meaning of the quality of research, for example, and to follow their own intuition about what kind of questions need to be asked through what they've witnessed in their own communities and what is important for the everyday life of members of the community. And she also really encourages students to include community members' voices in the work that they do, to make it an integral part of the work that they do. So Prof. Welekazi, with that said, we'll be moving over to you for the first presentation. A reminder to the audience that if you have questions, you're welcome to document them in the comments section now, and we'll get to the questions at the end of all 3 sessions. Thank you, Prof. Welekazi.
Thank you, Samantha, and hello to everyone who is watching this afternoon. Could you please help me with the share screen? I don't seem to be able to share my screen from this side. I'm not sure what's happening. I'm not sure if there's something you need to do on your side to allow me to share the screen.
It looks like it's sharing.
It's sharing, okay. Can you see the slides now?
Yes.
Thank you, perfect. All right, this work is part of work that Oyama, Chona, and myself doing currently. It's under the umbrella project that's looking at social cohesion. And as part of that work on social cohesion, we were looking at gender-based violence broadly. And for today, we're going to narrowly focus on domestic violence. So we have entitled our presentation for today, Domesticated Polyviolence Against Women During the 2020 COVID-19 lockdown. And it is going to be, hopefully, clear in a minute why we are saying women are subjected to domesticated polyviolence during the lockdown. So this is our presentation overview, just a roadmap of what I'm going to be saying in the next 15 to 20 minutes. People who are part of this webinar today should know that South Africa has a long history of violence and high rates of gender-based violence, but in particular against women. We all know that gender-based violence can be violence against other people like men or gender non-conforming persons, but today we are focusing in particular against women. Gender-based violence is complex and it refers to a vast range. Of violations that are perpetrated against a person because of their gender. And just to remind us that gender-based violence is actually a crime, and it is a crime that is perpetrated in defense of patriarchal traditional values of gendered hierarchy and sex role expectations that uphold the society's control over feminine and gender non-conforming sexualities. So, for example, in the domestic sphere, perceptions that a woman has transgressed gendered sex roles may cause tensions in the home, and these tensions could result in arguments that turn violent. There's a lot of work that has been conducted in South Africa by different researchers from different perspectives that is helping us to know the violence against women epidemic so that we can match the response to the extent of the epidemic. What this work shows us is that 1 in 4 women in the general population experience gender-based violence in South Africa. And police records, so there are 2 sources of information in terms of the data. It's surveys, and these surveys show us a higher prevalence of gender-based violence, but we also rely on service records. And police records showed us that nearly 3,000 women were killed in South Africa in 2017 and 2018. And in fact, if you're working in the gender-based violence space, you may have seen a recently published book on femicide. And that book suggests that the number is higher. So there has been an increase steadily in the number of women who are killed in South Africa. And the 2017-2018 data shows us a 11% increase from the previous year. Also, sexual assault has also increased from about 6,271 to 6,786, according to the police records. But we do know that service center data, including the police and other service centers such as the NGOs, their data is a gross underestimation of the extent of the problem of gender-based violence in any country, not only in South Africa. So today, I then am talking also about alcohol abuse, and I arrived at this relationship between gender-based violence and alcohol abuse because of the questions that were asked by many people in the public during the first week of the lockdown, when we were receiving news about the increase in the number of women who were calling the Gender-Based Violence Command Center. People were alarmed and they were asking themselves, but there is no alcohol, and so why are we seeing these increased numbers of gender-based domestic violence? So alcohol abuse refers to a regular or occasional excessive consumption of alcohol, causing harm to self and to others. And notwithstanding gender and race differences in patterns of alcohol abuse in South Africa, South Africa is still named as having the highest level of per adult capita alcohol consumption in the rest of the continent. I'm sure you also heard the Minister of Transport recently, he did allude to that. High levels of alcohol use in South Africa are linked to increased levels of violence against women and femicide. So how does this happen? Alcohol aggression theories tell us that the effects of intoxication is what we should be looking at in terms of intoxication and aggression through what they call diminished behavior inhibition. So what happens is when people are intoxicated, then the aggressor, the person who's been taking the alcohol and intoxicated, may see the actions of the other, we call the other, the target group, as ambiguous. In a gender-based violence setting, for example, the behavior of the partner may be perceived as arbitrary and threatening. And so the person who is intoxicated, and I'm gonna call this person a man, the man might then find that this situation is exacerbated by perceptions that I'm being disrespected by my girlfriend, or my wife is just talking to me like this. If there was no alcohol involved, this would be a different ending. However, because alcohol impairs cognitive systems, in a state of intoxication, the aggressor may not pay attention to alternative cues, they may not listen to alternative explanations of the behavior, and they may act to resolve what in their mind at that point in time is ambiguous situation, and they resort to violence in order to, I'm gonna use inverted commas, defend themselves against what they see as a perceived threat from their partner. So because of the theories of alcohol aggression and what they've told us, research then suggests that removing excessive alcohol drinking could significantly reduce the domestic violence and increase safety for women. And we've been seeing these recommendations that we need to reduce excessive drinking in our communities so that we can reduce domestic violence and increase safety of women. So 2020 happens, and globally, business as usual ceased for many of us because of the novel coronavirus, COVID-19. So what COVID-19 did was it forced the society into countrywide lockdowns across the globe. And in South Africa, we also responded. And one of the things that we did, Hocta suspended alcohol sales. And yay, I mean, we've been asking for alcohol to be reduced, and now alcohol sales are suspended, public drinking is suspended, and we let our guard down. So the alcohol ban created what researchers call the natural experiment to examine the hypothesis that removal of excessive alcohol would reduce men's use of violence against their partners. Perfect. This study is not expensive. Alcohol has just been removed by a pandemic. We have a natural experiment. Now let's see how the hypothesis turns out. So in this paper, we looked into the perceptions that domestic violence incidents, remember incident is the new case, so the new case of domestic violence. we were hoping that it will decrease as a result of the alcohol ban. So we're looking at that. So we want to examine what are the probable impacts of reduced alcohol drinking on rates of domestic violence during this period. We then offer an analysis based on the work that we do. And you can agree or disagree with this analysis. It's fine. We will also hear from our colleague from Zimbabwe, and we'll hear from Welekazi, and we would like to hear from you as well. What is your own take on the patterns that were reported during this period? And we make recommendations for gender-based violence against women interventions during and post-2020 COVID-19 lockdown. So, alcohol use and domestic violence. And you will see there that I have suggested that alcohol use was reduced because of the ban, but then I cancelled that myself, and I'm gonna tell you why I cancelled that. So the United Nations raised a concern at the beginning of the lockdowns that the risk of alcohol misuse may become more acute during the COVID-19 crisis. This is very important. It's very important that we remember throughout this presentation that the UN raised this concern early on. Why? Because alcohol consumption was going to continue, and indeed it may have continued in a number of places that could not be policed because we relied on the police. Yes, your legal establishments may have closed. However, the alcohol ban did not affect people who keep alcohol in their homes. So if you keep alcohol in your house, you could continue drinking alcohol. So drinking in private homes continued. Also, it was very difficult to match the scale of illicit purchases of alcohol. And this continued because we did not have enough security forces and police to monitor this. And we saw again a surge in robberies of liquor establishments, a lot of shebeens and taverns, and even in malls, in fact, and alcohol warehouses were broken into in March and April. And so it has not been possible for researchers to estimate the reduction in alcohol drinking because of this. And to top it up, I mean, we saw sometimes police throwing alcohol, away in homes of people who were brewing their own alcohol. So there was home brewed alcohol. There was also bootleg alcohol. Bootleg alcohol has always been there in South Africa in the other markets. And so if you have access to the other markets, you buy bootleg alcohol. So we conclude that the physical and psychological lockdown, it is possible that the risk for binge and excessive drinking at the beginning of the lockdown may have accompanied the psychological panic and increased whilst being at home. So just like a lot of us went to Macro and we bought a lot of things that I'm not going to mention today in anticipation of the challenges of the lockdown, some people may have bought alcohol. If they couldn't, then they resorted to producing their own alcohol at home, or they bought alcohol illegally from the people who were selling alcohol from the jobs of breaking into the establishments. So let us leave alcohol for a minute and go to what happened with gender-based violence in the domestic sphere. So we call this gender-based domestic violence during the lockdown. So of course, there was no survey during the lockdown. Remember earlier on, I said there are two sources of information in terms of gender-based violence. It's research surveys, but also service center records. And we now rely on service center records. One of the service centers is the South African Police Services. And there have been news that the police statistics for the first week of the lockdown showed that there were more than 2,300 complaints of gender-based violence that were recorded. However, for the South African Police Services, this suggested a reduction in reported cases of domestic violence in South Africa when they compared it with the statistics from their previous records. We also had reports that were coming from the Gender-Based Violence Command Center, which is housed at the National Department of Social Development. And these records suggested a surge in gender-based violence in South Africa since the implementation of the national lockdown, with 87,000 gender-based violence complaints in the first month alone. So we do know that there are data challenges because people who call a call center or people who call the police because of their domestic violence experiences are not a true representation of the women who experience violence in their homes. However, despite these data challenges, we are now convinced that there was an increase in gender-based violence against women, and this has been confirmed by people who work in the gender-based violence space on the ground. So what happened during this time in terms of public health measures to deal with the pandemic? So the public health measures that were adopted to regulate the spread of the novel coronavirus put restrictions in terms of movements. So this meant that women who were at risk of domestic violence were stuck at home with an abusive partner. However, feminist wisdom prevailed early on. Like I said earlier, the UN issued a statement that we all received that warned the global society that there was going to be a violence spike if women are not allowed to access services and they are at home with their abusive partners. But of course, we don't always listen to feminists. So because the woman had warned that as people spend more time in close proximity in household with, in isolation, women and children are at a risk of experiencing higher levels of violence. We also saw in the US gun ammunition sales also rising as the economic activity was also suspended. More and more men were at home with their partners. Now, we don't know why people were buying guns, but I am sure they were not going to shoot the virus, but they did buy guns. So they were going to have a target. We saw in Switzerland, Justice Department prepared for increases in domestic violence during the lockdown. And you can go on and on. There is enough data on the UN website about how different countries started to prepare themselves for a rise in gender-based violence against women in the domestic sphere in particular. Not so much in South Africa though. And what we saw early on, by the 30th of March, Google reported that there was a 75% spike in searches for the help for domestic violence, indicating that women were trying to find places that can offer them some help. The number of women calling domestic violence support services was reported to have risen significantly in various countries. In some parts of Asia, North and Latin America, in Europe, there was a rise in the number of women calling helplines, reporting abuse. There was an increase in domestic violence that was reported in places such as Australia, France, India, Wuhan, Spain, Brazil, Cyprus, and New Orleans. In Tunisia, calls to the helpline in the first days of the confinement increased fivefold. In Italy, calls to helplines dropped sharply. However, SMSs and emails to the support services increased. There is something that we know about the different societies that we come from. In less individualized social and cultural contexts, we do know that people tend to turn to each other when times get difficult. We know this because the number of women who access formal services, whether it's NGO, it's Department of Health clinics, calling the GBV command center or going to the police, is a drop in the ocean compared to women who tell their friends and family and colleagues and people that they know. However, what was supposed to be spatial distance from a public health point of view became social distance. So there's a difference between spatial distance, which is the physical distance that is aimed at preventing the spread of the virus. However, because people were not allowed to move, you were not allowed to visit your friends and family, then you were not able to access the social support that those people would ordinarily offer to you. So this resulted in what we call in this presentation social disconnection, because people could not access their own informal sources of support, because COCTA had suspended movements, not only for business purposes, but to visit friends. By the way, in lockdown 3, we're still not allowed to visit friends, even today. So we do know that ordinarily women avoid formal sources of help due to a number of reasons, such as shame, fear of reprisals, lack of knowledge on how to access these. But unfortunately, during this same time, community-based services were also closed. And so some of the community-based NGOs shifted their services to online and telephone assistance, and these were not accessible to many women during this period. So help seeking was impaired for many women during this period. It is also possible that during this period, awareness of the availability of national command centers then was heightened. So more people, because they could not talk to friends and family, because they could not go to their local NGOs, they became aware that there was the national command center. So they started calling the toll-free number. So remember, there is a difference between the experiences and the real data and the number of people who actually call the national command center. So for the first time, I argue, the National Command Center was confronted by the extent of the scale of the problem of domestic violence, because the sources of help were suspended and closed, and so people were diverted to the National Command Center. So the close proximity and visibility of police as well that was in our communities may have falsely given an impression to some that if I call the National Command Center, I mean, I see police all the time roaming my streets, and so maybe there is a, some kind of radio communication that they will be able to come to my house if I call the command center and report gender-based violence. However, we do not know if the victims who called that center did get the support, but they may have hoped that they will be helped this time around. So the UN estimates that about 40% of women who normally experience gender-based violence never seek help. So those people may have probably called for help this time around, and that made it look like gender-based violence against women has increased. So violence against women is a continuum of behaviors, and these violations are spread across institutions. During the lockdown, institutions such as schools, churches, workplaces, recreational activities, and other public spaces were closed. What this meant was teachers, lecturers, priests, managers, coaches, and all of these people that we know are implicated in the perpetration of violence against women. These people were home. So their targets were the people who were at home. So the perpetrators of violence, our brothers and friends and neighbors and schoolmates and uncles and fathers and grandfathers, and all of these people were in our close proximity. And their targets, the women, the girls, the nieces, their children, the grandchildren, partners, wives, bore the brunt of having the economic activities suspended, and all of these people come back home. We know this, and that is why we argue today that the lockdown in fact domesticated polyviolence that is experienced by women every day in their lives. When we are at school, when we are at churches, when we go take a taxi, when we are at work, women experience violence. But now that violence, which we call poly-exposure, exposure to multiple forms of violence in different spaces, was now domesticated. It was all brought to our homes. So the perpetrators of violence, arguably sober, were at home. Professional women in their spaces experience microaggressions. Those male counterparts are now home. Women in political spaces experience same microaggressions. Those people were at our homes. Women in the business sector, we know this, you must read the reports, we're not going to go through them today. Those perpetrators were at home. So we do know that whilst people expected that with the lifting of the alcohol sales and public drinking, there would be reduced violence against women. And people were shocked and surprised when there was no reduced violence against women. We argue we should not have been shocked and surprised, because girls are not safe from violence in schools, and yet teachers are sober. We know that girls and women are not safe from violence in churches, and yet priests are sober. We know that girls and women are not safe from lecturers in colleges and universities, and yet lecturers are sober in those spaces. We know that women are not safe from their colleagues in places, and yet their supervisors, their managers, their colleagues are sober in those spaces. So we know that alcohol contributes to violence against women, but because it is not a cause of violence against women, reducing alcohol was not going to immediately mean that there is no violence against women, when women were in fact locked at homes with the perpetrators. So what we did, which is unfortunate as a country, and other countries did the same, we'll hear from Naomi perhaps about Zimbabwe, was that we criminalized movements and we banned social visits. And we should not have done this if we had listened to the warning from the UN early on in March. We know that we closed the help centers for abused women. We should not have done this if we had listened to the UN advice early on in March. But we did this, as we always do, because we always put feminist foresight in hindsight. We always want to say, we wish we knew. But this time we should have known because we were warned. So now we need to stop putting feminist foresight in hindsight. And that is the only recommendation that you can take home from this presentation. That from now on, when we deal with a pandemic, even outside of a pandemic, we need to engage with and take advice from a range of gender experts. We need to strengthen support systems for women who plan to escape from abusive situations. Believe you me, the extent of domestic violence in our society is such that as we speak in this webinar, there is a woman who is planning to escape. Do we have a support system for that woman who's trying to escape an abusive relationship? We need to strengthen those systems for those women. We need to strengthen support systems for women who are in the process of separation and divorce. If you look at data for femicide, that data sometimes suggests that women are at risk of being killed by their partners during the time of separation and divorce. So when there is a situation where a woman is planning or is serving divorce summons, we need to immediately put in place a support system even outside of the pandemic. We need to always ensure that women who are in abusive relationships or their partners find alternative homes, because we know that perpetrators of violence against women escalate the intensity of the violence when there is a possibility for a breakup, for a separation, or when there is a possibility for a divorce in a relationship. I wish I could end this slide here, but I know that researchers like to hear concluding remarks and recommendations. So my concluding remarks for the researchers is that we are aware that this analysis during this time is limited because we do not have depth in terms of getting access to reliable data, which is tailored for purposes of understanding gender-based violence during lockdowns, which is also disaggregated because the data that we have been receiving has not been helpful. Some gender-based violence cases, for example, in the GBV Command Center data, some cases such as child custody, maintenance, marital problems are logged as non-violence. So they are not logged in that data set as cases that are linked to gender-based violence. And we know that these situations are linked to gender-based violence. So with lack of reliable data as well on alcohol use, as we have explained that there was no monitoring of alcohol use. So we cannot say that the ban did reduce and by how much did it reduce alcohol use in our communities. So it's very difficult to delink alcohol from violence that happened during this period. So in terms of research, we recommend that data could be collected, and that better data should in fact be collected so that we have a better understanding of this relationship between alcohol, pandemics, and violence against women. So with what we have now, the data could be an indication of the shift of what we have called public violence to the domestic space, and hence the title of our presentation, that we have domesticated public violence. Women are at risk of this violence every day in their other lives, but this has shifted to the domestic sphere. It is also difficult to ascertain if the gender-based violence against women or if it was reporting that increased. So whilst we are all up in arms and we think that violence against women increased during the lockdowns, maybe it did not increase. Maybe it just shifted to the home. That's the first thing. Secondly, maybe the reporting of the cases increased. But also it is possible that men who are at risk of harmful drinking practices are the same men who are at risk of committing acts of violence against their partners, so that there is no relationship per se between those, but that we need to tackle both men's risk of abusive alcohol drinking and men's risk of perpetrating violence against women. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Welekazi, for your very important presentation. And we take heed of your comment and your advice to seriously engage with feminist thinking and putting it at the forefront to shape our responses towards this issue. So thank you very much for your presentation. We will address questions for you at the end of the session. Right now, I'd like to introduce our second panelist. Dr. Naomi Wekwete is a senior lecturer at the Center for Population Studies, University of Zimbabwe. She has over 25 years of experience in conducting policy-orientated research for government ministries and research and program evaluations for several organizations and several non-governmental organizations. Dr. Wekwete has been the UZ coordinator of the Regional Young Women Leadership in Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights, and she's been involved in this project since 2010. It is a project spanning 7 Southern African universities. She's also produced various publications in peer-reviewed journals, books, book chapters, and research reports, and has been a reviewer of regional and international journals. She has won several awards, including the Sabbatical Research Grant, HIV/AIDS and Social Sciences Research Grant, Senior Scholars Research Grant, HIV/AIDS Challenge in Africa, and the Simon Population Trust Research Grant for PhD research. And my conversation with Dr. Wekwete about the work that she does and what motivates this work, for her, she spoke about the main motivation being her drive to improve young women's lives and the felt contribution that she can make to provide evidence through research. Some of the challenges that she discussed that she experiences doing this kind of work within her context is particularly that she's experienced that some gender-based violence perpetrators are actually leaders in communities, or they hold very high-profile positions. And in this case, she experiences many of these men to actually undermine the research that she does. In most cases as well, she says that perpetrators of sexual violence are relatives. And it becomes a challenge as most cases are not reported because people often fear sending their relatives to prison, for example. So these are some of the core challenges that she discussed. But in spite of this, always there are positive moments, there are sources of inspiration. And Dr. Naomi spoke particularly about a project that she's involved in with students, a project that she's coordinating. And the findings from this project showed that there was actually, very, very serious and prevalent experiences of sexual harassment from some staff at the university. And these findings from the research project were presented to authorities, and she says that action was actually taken to address these issues. So this is one example of what really drives her work in the field. So thank you, Dr. Wekwete. We really look forward to your presentation, and over to you.
Thank you, Samantha. Thank you for that elaboration of myself. I'm also impressed by that. Okay, I think I need to share.
Yes.
Okay, let me just open it here. Okay.
Yes.
Let me just share. Okay. Thank you, Samantha, for the presentation. I was also listening to Mzi. I call him Mzi. I don't say Prof Mzi because I'm now used to that a lot. I've heard what she was saying, and most of hers was mostly on alcohol. But you find with Zimbabwe, I'll be looking generally at what has been happening now. Why the increase in gender-based violence, which has been presented, which has been reported by all organizations working on gender-based violence. So that's why I call it gender-based violence under COVID-19 lockdown. So I'll start off, I'll have my presentation. I'll start off with the introduction, just explaining what gender-based violence is happening in Zimbabwe, what is the prevalence of gender-based violence, and also move on to the reported cases of gender-based violence that have happened during this period, and also maybe look at the causes. What are these causes of gender-based violence under this lockdown? And also maybe the responses that have been taken by the organizations in some of the government, as well as the challenges. So I'll start off first with the gender-based violence in Zimbabwe. You find gender-based violence is already there. It's a problem in Zimbabwe. It's there. And you find at least 1 in 3 women have been affected by the gender-based violence. The latest survey that was conducted was in 2019, which is the Zimbabwe Multiple Indicator Survey, shows that 39% of girls and women aged 15 to 49 years had experienced physical violence. And the physical violence is the largest, it has the highest prevalence. But if you look at sexual experience, 12% had experienced sexual violence since the age of 15. And what we should note also is that most of this gender-based violence is happening within between partners, intimate partners, although we have other cases where you find relatives or maybe people known to the person. Now, when we come to the COVID-19 lockdown, it came as a result because the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in national lockdowns in almost every country, and restricting movement of people outside of their homes to contain the spread of the virus. The first COVID case in Zimbabwe was reported on 21 March 2020, and that was imported. So you find our first cases of COVID-19, all of them were imported. I remember one was from the States, one from the UK, and as we went along, there were more cases coming in. So the local transmission started on 24 March 2020. Zimbabwe imposed a 21-day national lockdown on 30 March, and it was supposed to be a 21-day lockdown, but it was further extended because the cases were actually rising. And even up to now, you find cases are even now rising, even at a faster pace, at a sharp increase, and you were almost all worried about what is happening. So now the lockdown is indefinite. We don't know when it's going to be released. But during the second month, it was sort of eased because of the cases were still very low. Remember, we're just having 59 cases for quite some time. Until then, we have thousands. Then the government decided to put back the stricter lockdown restrictions. So increase in the GBV cases is actually due to this lockdown. That is what we discovered. And girls and women are confined in one place with their abusers, who are usually intimate partners. Remember, I said in the beginning that GBV is always in the Zimbabwe, but you find it's within the intimate relationships. So you find most of this. Actually, now you have the partners staying in one house for a long time. That leads to GBV. The risk is even higher where there is a history of abuse. Where abuse has been happening, you tend to see that more people will actually women will be victims of violence and girls. Methods. This was a very difficult time. I'm still working on it because I want to come up with a detailed analysis on the GBV under lockdown in Zimbabwe. It was very difficult because everyone is at home. Most people are at home, and even the organizations which I wanted to visit, I wanted to include a lot of the organizations, but because most of them are working from home, they are not in the offices, it's difficult. So most of the methods that I used, it was desk research, and from NGO reports and from the media reports that I was also getting, and also some of the articles that actually have been written on gender-based violence during this period. Also, I managed, it's an interview. Hello?
Sorry, we've just had a request if you could please put your slides on slideshow, just so just for the clarity, so that the
sorry.
In a bigger format.
Thank you. I thought they were on slide. Thank you so much. I thought I had clicked. Okay.
Thank you,
so
Naomi.
You find with the interview is not actually an interview per se, but I would phone the person that I was talking to, the program officer at Musasa Project, clarifying on some of the information that she would have given me. I actually called her. First time I sent a message to the Musasa Project, and they wanted to see exactly what was happening, to see the cases that were being reported. So she gave me a list of the cases that have been reported up to end of June, and then I had some problems with understanding some of the statistics. So she actually explained to me, and I had a telephone interview with her. If you go to the reported cases, I'll start off with the Musasa, because Musasa was my major source of the data. Musasa Project is a national organization, an NGO in Zimbabwe that is dealing with issues of violence against women and offers counseling and shelter services to abused women. So you find they have got some centers scattered all over the country, where they offer counseling and offer services as well, and also even offer shelters. Just before the lockdown, I was involved in the gender-based violence data collection methods for the country, and we traveled through most of these organizations, and I really had an appreciation of what they were actually doing. So you find from the recorded cases, when the lockdown started, they reported that 764 cases of GBV on their hotlines in just 11 days. So it was just 11 days, they had 764 cases of hotlines. These are hotline calls. They are not going into the center. And when compared to the cases per month, you are talking of an average of 500 to 600 cases per month. So you find within 11 days, the cases had actually gone even beyond the normal, the 500 to 600 cases before the lockdown. For the 3 months, you can see that in April, because our lockdown started on the 30th of March, so you find in April, we had the highest numbers of these cases using the hotline. They were 1,312, and then they declined to 915, and then later to 779. So in my first impression, I thought maybe the GBV was declining. But when I spoke to the program officer, she was saying, no, this is because the first month people were stuck in their houses. They couldn't even go out and report. That's why the figures, the numbers are so high on these hotlines. But as the time proceeded, you find the lockdown was eased in May, and you find the cases now were actually declining, which means now people were going back to those stake centers, reporting physically the cases. So these are just the cases for the calls, not all the cases. So the center received 3,006 GBV calls from hotlines across the country between April to June 2020. So these are the center, the hotlines for SASA project alone. We are not considering the other organizations. 75% of this shows it's a 75% increase compared to the pre-lockdown months, which means it was a sharp increase of the calls, of the cases. And I've explained why it was that sharp, because people now were forced to make calls rather than to go physically and report. April, I talked about the April, and you find it has declined, the cases, and this is largely due to relaxation of the lockdown. People are now free to go into the centers and report, but it's not everyone. You find some people still, they are restricted, they can't, because it's saying essential services are the ones, and people working in essential services are the ones who are supposed to be going out of their homes. So most survivors were now able to visit the walk-in centers. That's why it has declined. But now looking at all the cases for those 3 months, it's not just 3,000, but you find, I talked about the shelters. SASA project has got shelters. Those reports from those shelters cases were 483. We also have what we call the one-stop centers, whereby we have all the services. For example, we have the police there. We have the organized organizations, dealing with legal service, dealing with counseling, and all and even the health. And usually these one-stop centers are in hospitals. They are sited in hospitals, so that one can have all the services. A victim can have all the services in one time. So out of those one-stop centers, 1,933 cases were reported. And also we have mobile one-stop centers, whereby they move from one place to the other. And those are even more. You can see it's 4,216, because they are moving from one place to the other. They are able to get to people from the communities. And also the SASA project has got district offices, and those offices also recorded the cases, and it's a bit less, about 909, because as I have said, yes, we've eased the lockdown, but you find most of the people are still not able to move around freely. This one is the main forms of GBV that were happening. When I asked here, the program officer said it's mostly physical and psychological violence which was happening. We also have economic and economic violence that was also happening, because they have different forms of violence that are listed. And there's one here which didn't come out, which is sexual violence. The black one up there is sexual violence. So I've talked of SASA project, which is the main one, but you find we have so many organizations that are working on gender-based violence, but I just picked a few so that at least we want to see. They've also been showing that gender-based violence has been on the increase. The first one is the Zimbabwe Gender Commission. This is a commission for the country, and it's a government commission. They reported a 50% increase in GBV cases from March to 1 June 22. And here it's just up to 1 June. Yet SASA project, I managed to get up to end of June. Also, we have a platform for youth and community development. This is an organization based in Chipinge. This is a rural, mostly a rural area. And I also wanted to see exactly what is happening in the rural areas. So you find they also reported, this was through media reports that I saw on when I Googled. You find they had recorded 110 cases of GBV in Chipinge, which is to the eastern part of Zimbabwe, which was almost double the average of 62 cases the organization usually receives per month. Another organization I said, I've been to, Musasa is mostly in Harare, it's housed in Harare, but it has got offices all over. But you find for Blue Whale, I picked on Mtonjeni Women's Forum to capture the southern part of the country. They reported sharp increase in GBV cases like the other organizations. By April 15, they had attended to 23 GBV cases over the phone. That just which is less than a month, which is about half a month, less than 2 weeks actually, and almost reported the number for the month. In January, they actually before the lockdown, they had cases of 25 cases. In February, they were 20, and in March, just in March, they were 11. So of the 23 cases, this included 2 women who were chased away from their homes by their spouses, citing fear of COVID-19 infections. So now these are the kind of information that I would want even when the lockdown is removed, to go and investigate why the spouses were fearing the wives, why not the men or women fearing the husbands. So I think that also need to be investigated. We also have the Zimbabwe Republic Police, and we have this victim-friendly unit, whereby you find especially on these one-stop centers, where they are all there, you find there's also a victim-friendly unit. And even in the police stations, you also have the victim-friendly units, whereby they also reported 193 cases between 30 March and 13 April. And I remember Mzi was talking about the police having lower cases. And I was saying to myself, yeah, but in Zimbabwe, we find the cases reported by the police are very low compared to those reported by Musasa Project. Musasa Project had reported 764 cases, yet they only reported 193 cases. And also, this one is low even compared to their cases that they have reported the same period in 2019. But if you look at it, that's when you discover that the lockdown restricted victims to go and report physically to the victim-friendly unit. That's why the cases are so low. Otherwise, the GBV cases didn't go down, but it's only the victims were restricted in going and reporting physically. Low cases are due to the restricted movement of people during lockdown. So you find most of these cases, some of them went unreported. Some of them couldn't even call. Some are used just going to go and report. They are not used to having calls. So you find there are a lot of cases that went around unreported. And then looking at factors contributing to GBV, the first and the most one is the close physical proximity. You are stuck with your abusers in one place. And you even as wife and husband, you find when you are stuck in one place, especially if you are abusers, you are at high risk of being abused. The long stay at home with abusive spouses or abusers in the same house was the main reason why there was this increase in GBV. Then one quote from one of the founder of one of the organizations said, imagine being with your abuser 24 hours, 7 days a week, and you haven't had support in terms of counseling, mental support, legal service, and you are not in a safe shelter. That is very traumatic and painful because there is a high chance of the same thing happening regularly since it will not have been reported. The other one is economic security. With lockdown, you find most of the people who do, especially those earning income from activities, let's say from the markets and also the self-employed, they were also not working. And as a result, there was a insecurity in terms of income. Cases were linked to depleted income, which would not be replenished, as most were not paid, especially some of the organizations were not paid, or some of the people who were working, but because of lockdown, they couldn't get the salaries. And also, even after easing the lockdown, most people remained incapacitated as they had no means to earn money. And as a result, you find you have these uncertainties, and then somebody wants to venge on the woman. With economic problems, people face, this is one gender media expert has to say, with economic problems, people face, some men tend to vent out their frustrations on women and children they live with at home. Sometimes you find with men, they want to feel that they are still in control of everything. So they'll actually blame whatever is happening, shortages in the home, shortage of food in the home, they will blame it on the woman, and in the end, they actually target them. Other factors contributing to GBV, one was alcohol and drug abuse, which has been explained in detail by Prof. Z. You find with alcohol, usually when somebody is drunk, the person loses some mind, and then there are some people who actually, when they are drunk, that is the only way they can survive. They want to attack their wives. And also withdrawal problems, you find some people having withdrawal problems. If you are in a situation whereby maybe you are under pressure or you have so many things to do, sometimes you want to withdraw, and by withdrawing, sometimes you have problems with your partner. And also sex and conjugal rights. One day I just loved when they said, even in homes, we should practice social distancing, even with your husband. And there was that article that is on social media whereby the woman was measuring the distance on the bed. And I don't know whether it's really true, but you find sex and conjugal rights sometimes may have been also a problem because of the fear of being infected with the other partner, especially if the partner is working and is working in some places that are where you meet so many people, like in supermarkets and in public places. Also, the quarrels over family management or childcare issues was also contributed to GBV, and I think I have explained some of that. And also family care demands. Family care demands, you have to pay for the bills, for the water bills, for the electricity, and then even buy food. But because those things are not, you don't have the money, all this can come into effect. What are some of the responses? I was even looking this side from the organizations themselves. When I talked to Musasa Project, they actually said, they actually responded. Some of these cases have actually declined because there was massive campaigns to educate people about GBV and to report such cases. So you find there was also an increase in GBV because people were now able to report as many cases as they can. Also, in these centers, you find some of them where they need counseling. Some of them had opened, but the challenge what they were facing is equipping them with the PPEs. So you find some of the facilities had supplies of masks, gloves, and thermometers, which they actually used when their clients were coming in, so that they they don't spread the COVID to the other people. Also, temporary isolation centers tends for GBV survivors with suspicious symptoms, because remember, with the GBV survivors, some of them they are taken into shelter. So if you are taken into shelter where there are other people and you are infected, it means there will be a challenge to the rest of that safe house. So they were also temporary tents that they put in place. And also extra transport support as alternatives to limited availability of public transport for survivors. With social distancing, even in public transport, you find in buses, they were actually saying the bus should not have all 70 people seated, but they would have half of that because they wanted to observe social distancing, which means people who were actually going onto the bus, the number was limited, and some of them actually would have failed to get there. So they would then provide the extra transport for that. So what are some of the challenges? You find the inability of some survivors to report physically in these walk-in static centers was one of the challenges. And as a result, if we say, we might see the calls have increased, but the problem is some of the cases are not being reported because not everyone was able to go and report physically, and some of them were not able to have calls. Even when the lockdown was even relaxed, it was relaxed a bit, you find some of them were not even allowed to move out of their houses. Also, personnel have also been locked at home. They are supposed to be attending clients at the center, but because of some of the personnel there from these organizations locked at home, working from home, it's also difficult to report all the cases. The reduced availability of public transport during lockdown, as the number of all the public buses were stopped, and only Zupco, the national bus, was the one which was taking people. So some of the buses, they had actually now to hire some of the buses to be part of Zupco. But still you find with the social distancing within the buses, a few operating buses and the limited number of people per bus actually were also some of the problems, which also led to prolonged waiting times, and even some of them not even have the opportunity to get onto the bus. Then full reoperationalization of GB facilities continues to face challenges related to availability of basic PPEs, because because they had been relaxed, the lockdown, they had opened, but you find what was needed also was for you to get into a center, for you to provide services, you also need to have the sanitizers. You also needed to have a thermometer to test to take temperature of the clients. So what I can conclude is this is still an ongoing research. There's a lot of questions that have not been answered, which I need to answer. But I can say that because of this increase in cases of GBV, the organizations actually had massive awareness programs within the communities, so that they want to make sure the victims can easily report their abusers, and also massive awareness programs by government highlighted the risk, giving detailed information on how victims can access services. And maybe one thing that I hadn't said is that you find with the gender-based violence in Zimbabwe, it's Ministry of Women Affairs, Community, Small and Medium Enterprises is the one that coordinates gender-based violence. So you find all these organizations, they work with all these organizations work with Ministry of Women Affairs. And Hotlines should be readily available and accessible. You can see now the lockdown is now strict again. So we need more of these hotlines so that people can actually report their cases. And once they report again, we also need cases on those that are not even on hotlines, but also those that are not hotlines, to be informed about these hotlines, because some of them are not aware that there are these hotlines. And I think also the support systems within the whole chain are some of the things that can be looked at. Thank you so much. Thank you. Samantha, I'm through.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wekwete. Thank you for your presentation and for really providing us with such a rich picture about the realities of this and the challenges faced in your context. Thank you very much for your presentation. We'll address, I see there are some questions addressed to you, and we'll address those at the end of the session. So right now I'd like to introduce our third panelist, who will actually be responding to both these presentations, Welekazi Stofile. And when asked what motivates her to do this work, Welekazi provided a beautiful response as follows. Growing up as a young girl in a village in the Eastern Cape opened my eyes to the privileges that were enjoyed by the boy child. But also, upon my relocation to Johannesburg, I came across additional forms of oppression as a young woman, like racial oppression and gender-based violence, like harassment, that often escalated to physical violence if one ignored the catcalling. So I decided that I wanted to contribute to building a just society. For Welekazi, one of the biggest challenges in doing this kind of work is that often you do the work, but you see very little change. So for example, witnessing the continuing escalation of violence against women and girls and very little consequences. But for her, what keeps the hope alive, the inspiration, is knowing that through her work in some way, if she can assist a woman or a girl to get some form of redress for what she has gone through. Welekazi she works at the Chwara Nang Legal Advocacy Center. She is a director responsible for programs at the center, and she has over 27 years of experience working in the social justice sector in South Africa, and Southeast Asia. She's also worked as a legal researcher and training consultant for both the public and private sectors in South Africa. And she is interested in governance and social justice at the local level, particularly the livelihood of people living on the margins. Her research experience covers broad human rights, security and justice issues, such as women's rights, women's access to justice, and sexual and gender-based violence, amongst others. And she holds an LLB degree. So thank you, Welekazi. We look forward to your response and your reflections to the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. I am grateful for the opportunity, and I would like to thank Professor Mzee and Dr. Wekwete for a very insightful presentation that brings out a lot of interesting issues. I am trying to load my presentation, but I am struggling for now to find it. So. Just give me a second. Yes. Can you see it now?
No, it's not coming up yet. No. It's not shared yet. Did you click on the share screen at the bottom?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
Okay, then on your document, and then to share it again once you've selected it. Yes, there we go. Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Please, it's on slideshow format so that we have the big.
All right.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I decided to title my response as locked with abusers, women and girls in South Africa and Zimbabwe. And I want to agree with most of what has been shared by both Professor Nduna and Dr. Wekwete. And I want to then zoom in on the issue of reliable statistics in South Africa. And say that this has been going on for a very long time. It has not just started now because of the lockdown, because of the coronavirus pandemic, but also it's difficult for us to have reliable statistics if the only source during the hard lockdown in South Africa was the GBV Command Center. This was a concern because it's the reliance on the GBV Command Center was on the premise that every woman and girl who is seeking assistance would have a cell phone, would have data, would have airtime, or would have access to a network that would enable her to log that call. So without that, it would be difficult for us to say the statistics that we found through the GBV Command Center would be sufficient. Also, I felt that I need to bring out the issue of only focusing on statistics that come from the South African Police Services or from the GBV Command Center, because we know that in South Africa, there are other platforms that are used by women and girls to report gender-based violence, and in particular, domestic violence. For instance, Soranang conducted a study in 2019 that was titled Advocating for the Transformation of the Traditional Justice System to Better Respond and Uphold the Rights of Women Who Experience Gender-Based Violence. We found that many women and girls in South Africa tended to make use of the traditional justice systems to seek justice. And we know that those cases do not form part of the South African statistics on GBV that are normally reported by the SAPS. Also, during the hard lockdown, it was unclear as to whether these structures continued to receive and adjudicate cases that were happening in their communities. Also, the fact that organizations that were providing services to GBV victims and survivors had to shut down meant that we would again miss out on a number of women and girls who would have wanted to seek justice, but could not therefore access those centers, and as such, we would not have that statistics. So it is difficult to say that the number of GBV cases increased or decreased during the hard lockdown. That is the point that I want to make. And I also want to say that the curtailment of the freedom of movement also meant that those who were experiencing violence were unable to venture out and seek help. And also because there was no clarity when the hard lockdown was introduced, there was no clarity on whether those who are seeking assistance could venture out. Because if you remember, in South Africa, there were 3 allowances that were provided, that people could leave their home for grocery shopping, leave their home to seek medical help, or go to work as an essential worker. And there was no clarity as to whether the police would then allow a person who is saying, oh, I'm going to Tsaranang to seek legal advice, or I'm going to the court to apply for protection order. We didn't know. We don't have that information. So you may find that women and girls stayed in their homes because they felt that they could not leave their homes to seek assistance for gender-based violence. Also in South Africa, there was an issue of issuance of permits to civil society organizations providing services to gender-based violence survivors and victims. There was also a confusion around where these permits are obtained from. It was unclear whether it should be DST, it should be the CIPC, it should be COGTA, it should be local municipalities. And all of this contributed to this lack of reliable statistics, which makes me think that it is difficult for anyone to say, oh, we had an increase, or we had a decrease. And I'm hearing that we are sort of leaning towards saying that there was no increase in gender-based violence cases during the hard lockdown. Also, we don't have any evidence that tells us whether the patrolling law enforcement officials, the police and the soldiers were able to provide assistance to women who could have been running away from abuse. We don't even know that actually there were any women who approached them to seek assistance in the streets as they saw them patrolling their neighborhood. Another issue that it makes it difficult for us to have reliable statistics is the issue of shelters and access to shelters, because also whether women wanted to run away and go and seek help in a shelter, it was also unclear whether they could just up and go, and what kind of documents would they show to the police if they were stopped. When they were the grouping of the cases. We saw in Prof. Nduna's presentation that issues that related to maintenance, to child custody, they were not regarded as gender-based violence cases. So even the information that came out is not reliable. We also see the type of crimes that are recorded, crimes like indecent assault and molestation, and we also see logs, calls that are logged as the legal advice seeking, but we don't know what kind of advice was required by the callers. And also, we don't know what became of the cases that were reported. So what I am bringing out here is that the information that is available is not sufficient for us to come to a conclusion as to whether there was an increase of gender-based violence or even the types and forms of gender-based violence that were prevalent in the country during the hard lockdown. What is also disturbing is that it appears that the protection measure that South Africa put forth was based on the notion that every victim or survivor would have access to a phone and therefore be able to reach the command center. Another issue is that also there was this belief that if alcohol is taken off the table, we'll see a reduction in the number of gender-based violence cases. And I hear Prof. Nduna is also saying that it is difficult for us to say because alcohol was banned, there was no alcohol available in the homes. And that because there was no alcohol available, therefore the cases of GBV that are fueled by the excessive use of alcohol were reduced. We don't know that. We need to dig deep and find out whether the banning of alcohol resulted in the low numbers that we're talking about. We also don't know whether the low numbers that are reported in South Africa are because of the unavailability of alcohol or because survivors and victims were unable to go out and seek assistance. And also I'm in agreement with Professor Mzee when she talks about taking into consideration the input from feminists. And I also want to say that we saw in South Africa that when the COVID-19 responses were being planned, gender issues were not mainstreamed at all. It it was the civil society that kept on raising issues, asking questions around protection of women and girls or all victims of gender-based violence, that we saw other measures being put in place, albeit later at times. I also want to then look at Zimbabwe very briefly and say, interestingly, in Zimbabwe, Dr. Wekwete is able to talk about a sharp increase during the lockdown, but also it looks like the sharp increase is based on the statistics that she received from CSOs, not from the government. And also in Zimbabwe, it's interesting to see that survivors and victims were able to seek help online, but also in person at the one-stop centers. Whereas in South Africa, we were unable to get statistics from those centers. We are not even sure that women were able to go to care centers. We know that they were not able to go to CSOs that were providing assistance. Also in Zimbabwe, we saw that that victims and survivors do not often report as they lack understanding of what constitutes GBV. This is what Dr. Wekwete has said, and that is also a concern, that despite the various advocacy work that is done, there are still survivors that are unable to distinguish between GBV and other forms of violence against them. Also in Zimbabwe, we see that there was an increase in abuse, including exposure to sexual exploitation at border crossings. That is very interesting because in South Africa, there has been no study that has looked at what happened during the hard lockdown at the borders of the country. I also noticed, Dr. Wekwete, that when you were presenting that sexual violence tended, or sexual violence cases were 5%, were the lowest of the figures that you presented. And I wondered what could be the reason for that. Could it be related to reluctance to report sexual violence? Could it be fear of secondary victimization? Could it be fear of stigmatization? We need to also dig deeper into that. And I also noticed that in Zimbabwe, there were no statistics coming from criminal justice role players, from the traditional justice role players, despite the fact that we know that in Southern Africa, these forms of justice are being used, particularly in rural settings. So again, there is a need to look at what cases were adjudicated at the home level, at the village level, at the Nkosi level, or even at the chief level. And also you pointed to an issue of PPE and isolation spaces that were provided by international development agencies. And this again was a very good thing that sort of, I think, assisted CSOs to continue to provide assistance. And also I noticed that in Zimbabwe, you talk about working centers that were opened, but despite that, survivors could not go report because of the transport issues, because of the hard lockdown. So again, this points to the issue that when the regulations were designed and adopted, those who were sitting and coming up with these regulations did not think about gender issues, did not use a gender lens to plan for these issues. It was only after the fact that some of them were taken into consideration. So lastly, what would I recommend based on the two presentations? I think I agree with both of you that there is indeed a need to further delve into the issues that have not been answered thus far due to the various reasons that you advanced, ranging from the limitations in the research that you were conducting due to the hard lockdown. I think we need to look at the accessibility of the GBV hotlines and also look at availability of other reporting mechanisms for those without phones, for those who don't have airtime, for those with network challenges. I know that, for instance, the South African GBV Command Center line is set to the toll-free number. But one day I attempted to call it using a phone that didn't have an airtime, and I couldn't get through. So I am not sure whether it is indeed a toll-free number. Also, it would be good to look at the police response time from when they received the call. How long did they take before they responded? And it would also be good to look at the number of applications for protection orders during the hard lockdown, particularly that we have seen in South Africa a number of reports where women are said to have been turned away from the magistrate's court. There were 3 cases in the Western Cape that were in the media, and we also dealt with cases in Gauteng where women struggled to apply for protection orders because they were sent away by the court officials. Also, we need to look at the causes of the increase in cases of femicide in South Africa. We have not really delved into that despite the fact that in June alone, more than 21 women have been killed in this country. The enforcement of protection orders during lockdown, has that happened? If it has not happened, what are the reasons? There is no mention again in both studies there's no mention of cases of marital rape or even incest, despite the fact that the UNFPA and Equality Now warned earlier on that during pandemics, violence against girl children tend to increase, particularly rape. And we know that in South Africa, there are high levels of violence against children, and in particular the girl child. So it would be interesting to know what happened when children were locked down at home with their parents and relatives and communities, whether there was an increase in incest, and also whether women were raped by their partners during the hard lockdown. And of course, lastly, the impact of the lockdown on women and the children in terms of their mental health and the actual availability of psychosocial support and shelters. I think I'm going to stop there and again say thank you very much to both for their presentation.
Thank you very much, Welekazi, for your thoughts and insights into this. We really appreciate it. Time is running out, but I think that we will open a space for a few questions for the panelists. I see that there's been quite an engaged discussion going on via text in the comments section. So I might revisit 1 or 2 of these questions. Particularly, I see that Prof. Mzikazi has provided some answers via comment, but just to perhaps open it up so that the rest of the audience benefits from the discussion, and so that perhaps the other panelists may contribute something to answering these questions should they wish. So I believe that we've got our first question. Tsitsi Maratsi is online, and she's going to be presenting her questions for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for allowing me to just quickly pose my questions. First and foremost, I just want to express my gratitude to our presenters for very insightful reflections, and also to the respondent, Welekazi, for your response to the presentations, which for me also raise a lot of other questions. So Professor Nduna has actually responded to some of my key questions, so I will not waste time on that, but maybe just follow through with 1 or 2. So the first one has to do with data. So we know that for GBV in general, we actually have serious challenges in actually having reliable data that is verifiable and that can stand the test for evidence, especially when you want to advocate or make a case for an issue. So I don't know from the presenters and also other participants on this platform, if they also know what other data sources we can use to advocate for policy influence or behavior and attitude change. Also given that at times our official machineries, which are government-led, may not necessarily always have the latest data that is up to date about the incidence or scale of GBV. So what other credible sources of data can we draw on, given also the limitations of the COVID pandemic itself in terms of movement, in terms of access? So that is one. Secondly, in a situation like my country finds itself in, I'm from Zimbabwe, we actually have serious challenges where even resources that had been earmarked for development, for example, investments in maternal health, perhaps they haven't really reached where they were intended for various reasons, including corruption, as we have it in the media. So we have a situation where the demand is increasing, but the ability to respond, capacity-wise as well as resources, continue to be limited. How do we still make sure that the rights of women and girls can continue to count, can continue to be prioritized, especially in this context of COVID? Because we can see that we actually have serious health challenges that are directly correlated to the pandemic. And increasingly, we don't have the capacity to respond. So those are like my two outstanding questions, I guess, from the earlier questions that I had. And what recommendations would you suggest for activists like ourselves? I'm a human rights defender, I'm a feminist, and I really would like to make a contribution. And I'm not sure where to begin, given the enormity of the challenges that we have. Any suggestions? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tutsi, for your questions. I'd like to open it up to all the panelists. I see that Zikazi has typed your response, but Welekazi and Dr. Naomi, you're welcome to step in here and also provide your insights.
Maybe I can come in thank you so much, Tsitsi, on your questions and questions that you have raised. On responding to the sources of data of GBV, yeah, it's very challenging. Like what you are saying, it's very challenging, but you find all these organizations that are dealing with the gender-based violence, they are collecting data on GBV, but maybe the issue is that the definition of the violence may differ from one place to the other, but there are standard definitions that they should follow. And as I have said, I've been working on gender-based violence data collection systems, and you find there are challenges with that. Organizations in Zimbabwe are not government. They are non-governmental organizations who are working on gender-based violence, but also within each district or within each province, they have what we call a coordination committee, whereby they meet together, the government itself, the government from Ministry of Women Affairs, and also other ministries that are involved. Education, social welfare is also particularly involved in collection of gender-based violence. But they meet together, the NGOs together with the government, to come up with this. But you find it's challenging to come up with an actual gender-based violence. That is what they are actually trying to do in Zimbabwe, to have a central point where you can collect the GBV. Because if I go to one organization, they give me their gender-based violence, I go to another one. It's not coordinated. It's not where you can get one overall GBV for the country. So most of these GBV data that we cite are from the demographic and health survey and the multiple indicators survey, which are conducted by ZIMSTAT and UNICEF, with the help of UNICEF, and also UNFPA also support in the data collection. I think that's I can answer that for now.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Naomi. Would anybody else, the other panelists, like to respond to aspects of the question?
Thank you, Sam. I've taken a lot of the questions on the Q&A, so I was hoping that I would leave the few minutes remaining to my colleagues to respond. But I think I agree with Naomi that we do have definitions for gender-based violence, but recently, I think it was last week, I was invited to another space, and the group was interested in doing something about gender-based violence, which is really refreshing to have more people wanting to join the space. And one of the things that they seemed to agree on was that they didn't know how to define what was violence against women. And yet we've got this definition. So there are two things. Perhaps we need to communicate the definitions more widely. Sometimes because we work in the space, we assume, for example, in my presentation, I did not even define gender-based violence or violence against women because I'm making an assumption that we are already on the same page on the definitions. So maybe as people who work in the field, we also should not make this assumption and always include the definitions. But also people who would like to contribute to the work in the GBV space can look up the definitions because they are mostly available on the website, of the ministries, of the different ministries in South Africa. The Department of Women defines it, Social Development defines it, Justice also defines it. Justice has a website dedicated to femicide, and they define femicide. And each time the definitions have been updated, they load the new definitions. So I think that's something that we can take into account as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Just to say that with the issue of data, it will continue to be difficult until we find a way of centralizing data and using data from various sources, not just cases reported to the police, but also looking at cases that are held by the courts, cases that are in healthcare establishments or to do the care centers, but also the NGOs working in the GBV or voucher sector also sharing their data. I don't have an answer to how this could be done, but it's something that we can, as a human rights defenders working in this space, we can talk about. But again, I want to say that the majority of people in South Africa live in rural settings, and the majority of them do not have access to police stations. They have to travel long distances. And because of that, they tend to use a traditional justice systems. Or even those who don't want to use these systems, they are compelled to by the communities where they live. And in instances where they've opted out, they get punished. So we also need to get data from those structures so get a clearer picture of the levels of violence against women and girls in this country. With regards to the definitions of gender-based violence or violence against women, I think I agree with Professor Nduna, and because we have seen that women sometimes don't even report marital rape. They would say, oh, it's forced sex. I don't think it's rape. And Dr. Wekwete in her paper also spoke about this lack of knowledge, people not reporting because they don't know that this crime amounts to gender-based violence. So again, we need to do a more popular education in accessible languages, targeting communities, even in far-flung areas, for them to understand what is GBV and what is vouching. And what we did as an organization during the hard lockdown, we also used the opportunity of food distribution to put in flyers that unpacked what gender-based violence was, what violence against women was, and what legal remedies were available, including the list of organizations that were still open and providing services. Thank you.
Hey, Sam, can I just say something that has crossed my mind?
Yes, yes, sure.
How, I mean, the pandemic is a big deal. The COVID-19 pandemic is a big deal, but so is violence against women. And it's interesting how during the April, May, I think those 2 months, if you had a registered cell phone number in South Africa, did you realize that you were receiving SMSs that gave you information daily about coronavirus and how to stay safe and what to do? I mean, that's one of the things we could do with gender-based violence as well. As Welekazi notes, that most people do not know, do not have the information that we have. And most people in South Africa have access to a phone. You don't need a smartphone to receive that SMS. Even a feature phone can receive that SMS. So I think each time there has been a new updated either definition or bill, we've got a new policy in place, the government could afford to send these bulk SMSs to everyone, because everyone is at risk of either perpetrating violence or being a victim of violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Mzikazi. We have another question coming on live. George Makubalo. George, you're welcome to pose your question. Please remember to introduce yourself beforehand and just tell us where you come from. Thank you, George. George, are you there? Okay, if George is not there, then I will read his question, if that's all right. For Prof. Nduna, but I'm also going to open it up to the rest of the panelists for their thoughts. Feminist theory is central in thinking about gender-based violence. How can we reduce gender-based violence in society apart from the criminal justice response? I fear that we are not challenging patriarchy, that I believe is the main cause of GBV. I fear we are not challenging practices that perpetuate patriarchy, such as initiation and practices around courtship and marriage. Our society has changed, but practices around marriage have not changed. Why won't feminists challenge the relevance of practices like lobola, for example? Thank you, panelists. You're welcome to jump in with your thoughts.
Thank you, Sam. I already gave a response to George on the Q&A, and my response, I'm not sure if I can just go back to it and read my response to George, but my response suggested that the way that these ideologies and practices are entrenched in our societies, it may look as if we're not doing enough. And yet there is a lot that has been done to change the ways in which men and women treat each other, and in particular, the ways in which women are treated in the society. And that has resulted in a number of women being able to afford the rights, the human rights that they should be afforded. However, there are women who are still locked up in these situations because of traditional or cultural practices. And yes, advocates of gender equality, gender equity, and women's rights are working on this. Yes, it is not at a scale that matches the challenge. So I do not think that there is nothing that's being done to challenge this. I mean, if there wasn't anything being done to challenge this, we know where we would be as a society. We know that Sam and Mzi would not be talking on this webinar today. We are able to work and become professors and talk on these webinars because of all the work that has been done on gender rights. we are able to marry at our will and divorce when we want to. Yes, not everybody can exercise that, but most women these days can access divorce. Most women these days can be pregnant when they want to. Yes, there are still women who are subjected to customs and traditions that they would prefer to opt out of, but because these are entrenched in our societies, it's difficult for them to opt out of those. Some of these, Lobola is one example of those where some women would individually would like to opt out of, but because that is entrenched as part of the family, part of the tradition, they find themselves locked in that situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Welekazi. Naomi.
Yeah. I would also want to add to what Prof has just said. As I have said earlier, you find with the traditional beliefs and practices, it's not a thing that can be changed within a day. It will take years and years, and even some of them will never achieve it. So I think, as Prof Mzi was saying, yeah, the government, even the organizations, they are working with these people, especially the traditional leaders. They are actually working with the traditional leaders so that if that information or the is coming from the traditional leaders talking to the people, I think it's a better way than rather us as activists going into a community and say, you should not be doing this and that. This is patriarchal, this is what. So I think there's a lot that is going on, but you find with traditions, it's not just one thing that can be done in one day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Naomi, for your response. Welekazi, would you like to respond in any way to that question?
No, Sam, I think that it's been thoroughly responded to.
Okay, all right, thank you. There's George. George, you're a bit late. I already asked your question, but and you heard the response, and you also have the text from Prof Welekazi on the comments platform. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I have read through many of the questions, and I think that in some way your responses to these two questions have actually gone a long way to touch on many of the other questions. So I hope that in that way most of the responses have been addressed. If not, if you have any burning issues which still stand, you're welcome to contact the panelists. You're welcome to contact me, and I'll pass your questions on to them, on your behalf. And just a reminder that the recording of this session will be available on our website, Historical Trauma and Transformation Studies, and also on our Facebook page. The recording will be made available should you wish to listen again and use this as a resource or share with others who could not make it for this session. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the panelists for providing your thoughts and insights and for the rich discussion today. Thank you very much for joining us, and all the best with your important work moving forward. We will access your publications that you've mentioned, and particularly Prof Mzi, your new book. I'm looking forward to reading that. Thank you also to Dr. Kim Whale and Landi Meyering, who have set up the series of webinars for us, and Landi, who is the technical support behind the scenes, sending us messages and keeping things going behind the scenes for the technical support. Also to everyone at Historical Trauma and Transformation Studies who has joined us, and the audience. Thank you for all your questions and comments. There's been quite a hub of activity on both the chat and the Q&A sessions. So we'll also have a record of all those questions. So just lastly, a reminder about our next webinar session, which will take place on the 12th of August. And the title is Dust, Lenses, Sensors, and a Conversation, where Kenyan-born author Yvonne Ayambo Ower will be speaking about her award-winning book, dust. And this will be in conversation with Thando Njovane. So we invite you to that session on the 12th of August at the same time, 12 noon. It starts at 12 noon. So thank you very much to everyone for joining us, and especially to the panelists. Thank you. We really enjoyed your presentations. Very valuable work. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Sam.
Thank you, Prof. Muzi.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.